Well, I'm here with Sherry and my friend Cal, who's in incognito mode right now because he doesn't feel like he's in a situation, in a state where he wants to be seen on camera, which I can certainly understand. I probably shouldn't be seen on camera today either, but I don't give a shit, so I'm doing it anyway. uh, um, I put on my Darth Vader shirt this morning. I sort of thinking that I would just like own the villain role. But then Sherry wisely counseled me against us taking the conversation in the direction that I was want to take it. So I actually have no idea what I want to talk about now. So I'm
Well,
here,
yeah.
ready to listen. Sherry, give me something to work
Oh,
with, and we'll see
give you
what
some.
happens.
Oh gosh. I'm just drawing a complete blank. What about you, Cal?
Sorry, I'm in a conversation. Just one moment. I'm sorry.
Okay.
No problem.
You are in a
he's
conversation. It's
he's
right here.
multitasking.
Just a little
God
reminder.
bless you. It's good to see. Good to have Cal around again.
It is.
So okay, so let me try to give you a little bit more to work with. So just like what seems salient to you right now, other than the thing that we talked about off camera that I can't get out of my mind, and I'm trying to avoid talking about.
Well, you know I'll tell you what's going through my mind right now.
Okay.
And it's going to sound totally like what?
No, that's all.
But
That's probably means it's worth something. Let's go.
but I have, you've, I know that you, and maybe I'll just share it here in brief. I know that you have been working on a Grail Country RPG, right?
Yeah.
And of course you have to make characters, and I think the main character in this story is Nate the blacksmith. and I've talked to you about this before.
So I actually have here. Let me. So you're not talking about this blind. I actually wrote up a document in the middle of the night. Right here.
You
I will
said.
share it here on the live stream. If I can drag it onto the right mic, I have two monitors here, and I'm trying to drag it over to the right one so that I can read it. Okay. And I just accidentally undid what I did. I'll be looking up at the sky when I read it. my monitors. One of my monitors is a television, and it's placed above my head, so I can kind of. And this is what when I'm working. This is actually the monitor that I have podcast playing that I don't really have to look at, so I don't have to strain my neck. But actually, let me just here. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, come on. There we go. Now it's letting me. Okay, now I have it on the right monitor. Okay, so this is my little bullet point summary of I kind of wanted to write, but I had actually started working from the mechanics first and realized that was a design mistake. And so I wanted to write a little summary of what the game is about and kind of listed some of my sources of inspiration. So it's just a list of bullet points. So, Grail Country RPG. Bullet point 1. You are sworn defenders of the Blue Lady and the child that was promised. You have been sent out into the wild, dark, and foreboding places to find lost fragments of the Grail. Bullet point 2. You are the sworn enemies of the Shadow Prince and the Red Lady who sits on the thrones that belong by right to the child that was promised in the Blue Lady. Bullet point 3. You are drawn for the ranks of mortal men, elves, dwarves, and halflings, or occasionally a more exotic fairy kindred, an awakened animal, or a servant of the Shadow Prince or Red Lady, an orc, a goblin, a minotaur, who has caught a glimpse of the Blue Lady in a restored shrine and was transformed. You gain character improvements for recovering Grail fragments, defeating servants of the Prince of Lies, or the Prince. I changed it to the Shadow Prince in the middle and forgot. So the Shadow Prince. For defending one of the 7 noble virtues: courage, justice, mercy, generosity, faith, nobility, and hope. Grail fragments are found in desecrated shrines once dedicated to the Blue Lady. These shrines have been converted to the worship of the Red Lady and the Shadow Prince. These shrines can be found in the wilderness and in cities. Some are in the ruins of forgotten cities buried deep underground, or mountain cities of the dwarves of old, taken over by forces of the Shadow Prince. At the start of play, the child who was promised is an infant. The campaign ends once the last of the Grail fragments have been recovered. The child has reached the age of at least 15 and been guided by one of the player characters. And finally, the citadel of the Shadow Prince has been successfully captured, and the boy crowned Pendragon of the Grail country. Tracking of time, seasons, and festivals will be important. Sources of inspiration: King Arthur Pendragon role-playing game, all things Arthurian, mythology, folklore, fairy tales, Tolkien, Lewis Barfield, Charles Williams, and Joseph Campbell. So that was my little summary of the game that I am making, so that I know what it's about before I get further into the mechanics. So, and there's other ideas that I haven't put down on paper that are kind of floating in my head, but that's a good basic outline.
Can Nate the blacksmith use the hammer of Thor?
Well, what I can do is, so my next step actually, Sherry, is going to be creating like kind of a starting location.
You're going to do location and then characters.
So, and when I create the location, I'll create NPCs. So yeah, like a blacksmith modeled after me will probably be one of the NPCs in the place where the players start. And then mechanically, I've decided, like, so essentially the world is dominated by the false emperor, the Shadow Prince, and that but the Grail country, the Grail castle, where the Blue Lady and the child that was promised is protected, so he can't actually ever seize that. And so the player characters are going to go forth from the Grail castle out into the world to try to like reclaim these fragments, and as fragments are reclaimed and shrines are restored, that portion of the world will be removed from the grip of the Shadow Prince.
Can you repeat the part about the character catching a glimpse of the Blue Lady?
So I wanted to give a chance for people to play like monstrous races that like orcs and goblins and minotaurs and whatever else that end up being transformed by catching a glimpse of the Blue Lady in one of the restored shrines, so that they see the Blue Lady, and just the very sight of the Blue Lady transforms them, and so they seek out the Grail Castle and sign up for the quest.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, because like,
okay, let's talk about that.
That feels like, in a way, it feels like my own story.
Okay.
In the sense of
isn't that all of our stories?
It must be.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about this closing some distance, realizing all of a sudden, like the way it felt to me as a young man, like I was so emotionally numb that I didn't even know that I was numb when it was at its worst. And it's like to say that when you freeze so much that you don't know that you're freezing, you feel warm. And I was walking in snow, in a park that was covered in snow. And I thought, how everything was so silent, everything was so muffled. And I thought, there is such a silence in my mind. And so why is my heart racing? And then I realized, oh, I have emotions, I just don't feel them. And then that was like falling through ice into the excruciating freezing water. And because then suddenly I could feel everything. And it's like there's a point where you touch the bottom of your own soul, and you realize you gain a new identity, but it's realizing who you were. That the realization at that time was something like what David Bentley Hart writes about. That, see, at that time I thought I had a self separate from the people whom I was turning my back on and hiding from. I was hiding my face, and I realized that I really had no selfhood apart from these people, that my identity was in some way exhaustively constituted by all these relationships that I was that I was turning my back on. It was and I can tell the blue lady is Mary. Spiritually, I'm discerning Catholicism right now. I've changed a lot of my theological ideas, or even really just I've changed. I used to think that I had to do theology and understand things, and now I'm really kind of realizing that I don't. And so I never connected Mary to that kind of realization before. The realization I had as a younger man did not involve language of God at all. It didn't involve concepts of God, but it's kind of like kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, in the sense that it starts very small, but then it becomes the largest of plants or what have you. But I think I have an understanding of the metanoia, or I have an analog for it in my own experience. I don't know how it connects to the blue lady.
Well,
I think I would say it connects because you are connected by like, okay, so for me, the Theotokos has always been, we talk about Christ being born in us, and that's precisely what happened. Okay, to Mary. She carried Christ within her, right? And they were attached. They were connected to each other by an umbilical cord. And Mary was a human being, and human beings are made from the dust of the earth, and so I see that the Theotokos grounds us, keeps us from floating away, so to speak, into our abstractions. And
well, she's literally the body of the new creation.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just kind of stream of consciousness talking here, because I don't have any kind of final proposition to make, but everything is connected to the Theotokos, because the Theotokos is connected to Christ, literally. The Theotokos and Christ were connected to each other through an umbilical cord. Yeah, I don't know.
That's very good. I'm sorry, my connection is poor right now. It seems to me like maybe what it is the blue lady. She images such a gentleness, and that rather than be met with force, you realize you're met same as from Christ. Rather than be met with force, you're met with the most loving gentleness that you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
And then that affects the change of heart, because you realize that.
Well, Cal, she also calls Christ out into his ministry at the wedding at Cana. Okay. Yes. She calls him into the most terrifying epic of his life, right? He says to her, "You know what this means if I do this." Like, this reminds me of when I realized that my husband and I were going to get married. It was on our very first date, and I already knew. And
oh, wow.
and he touched me, like literally just touched me. And as soon as he touched me, I looked at him and I saw us waking up together. And I thought to myself, is he, am I going to be okay with this, like for the rest of my life? I was just going, into these major thought patterns. But as it turned out, we did get married, and I have been, waking up next to him since then. And
it's dipping into eternity almost. because
Well,
it's a full
yeah.
glimpse of the far future.
It's thrilling. It's thrilling, but it's also terrifying at the same time, right? Like, this is what I'm getting at with the wedding at Cana. You know, I think for both Mary and for Christ, it was terrifying, and she did it anyways.
So this is interesting, Cal, in light of what you said, and I think what you said is right. But what Talmberg actually goes in an interesting direction with this in letter 11 of Meditations on the Tarot is the letter on force, which he connects with the power of the Virgin, which he actually calls it force, but he subverts our notion of force. So he says this. He says, Virgin nature, therefore, has her part in all the miracles. And it is virgin nature participating actively in the miracles of divine magic, which is the subject of the 11th arcanum of the tarot. Force representing a woman victorious over a lion, holding its jaws open with her hands. The woman does so with the same apparent ease, without effort, with which the magician of the first arcanum handles his objects. Moreover, she wears a hat similar to that of the magician in the form of a lemon skate. One could say the two stand equally under the sign of rhythm, the respiration of eternity, the sign infinity, and that the two manifest two aspects of a single principle, namely that effort signifies the presence of an obstacle, whilst natural integrity on the one hand and undivided attention on the other hand exclude inner conflict, and therefore every obstacle, and therefore all effort. Just as the perfect concentration takes place effortlessly, so does true force act without effort. Now, the magician is the arcanum of the wholeness of consciousness, concentration without effort. Force is the arcanum of the natural integrity or being, a power without effort, because force subdues the lion not by force similar to that of the lion, but by a force of a higher order and on a higher plane. This is the arcanum of force.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean,
and he goes on later in the chapter that he specifically says it's a transformative, like the power of force is a transformative. So she's able to hold open the jaws of the lion not by being like exerting more power than the lion, but by transforming and essentially making the lion willing.
Making him willing, as with Christ, the Lion of Judah, she made him willing. Right, and he said, "Woman." Did he say, "What have I to do with thee"? I mean, is that? I mean, even "woman" is a strong word. It's like yeah. that's a hard saying, but yeah. I don't remember what he says after that. It might be, "What have I to do with thee?" When he names her woman, it's like he names her the new Eve. You could say it like that. Mm-hmm. Could see it like that. Yeah, she makes him willing, and then that inaugurates his ministry. There was something I wanted to say earlier just about the revelation of being met with gentleness rather than force, and that being a far greater force than anything you could previously conceive. Like MacDonald says, like, mere lonely power has no power to create. Love is the power of power. It's like you realize that it was for the sake of this love that you desired, that it was only ever for the sake of such a love that you desired anything, but you didn't realize it until that point.
Right.
And that's kind of what I feel as far as like being restored, or excuse me, being transformed after having caught a glimpse of the blue lady at a restored shrine. It's a very, very, very interesting idea, because it's a monster doing that, right? And so in some sense, the monster has no ontological right either to the vision or the transformation. And I really, as a younger man, I felt like a monster, at least afterward. It caused me to resonate a lot with Augustine's quotation that even monsters are divine creatures, and so to have their place in the providential order of nature. But I really, that's I guess that's what seemed salient to me about that detail in your story.
Well, none of that is happening on a conscious level, obviously, but well, Yes and no. I mean, I didn't choose my images at random, but it wasn't fully conscious. Let's say that.
But I wish I had better connection when Sherry was explaining what she was saying. It's helping me to understand a lot of Marian theology that I didn't understand before, in particular the idea of there being joined by an umbilical cord. There's sort of this proposed, as it were, fifth dogma in Catholicism that Mary is the co-redemptrix, and the sort of the channel through which all graces flow to humanity.
Well, without
Okay.
Mary, there is no Christ, you see. Like this is what makes her blessed among women, right? Because I'm sure the question arose down through the ages. Like, I mean, in my imagination, okay, God is knocking on the door of many women's hearts, saying, "Do you have room for the Christ?" And the only one who says yes is Mary.
Yes, and that's the sense in which she's conceived without original sin. Let's say in Catholic theology.
Yeah.
Tomberg was Catholic, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Tomberg was Catholic.
And so what's the sense there? Because if Mary is co-redemptrix, they still say that what she's, or if she's conceived immaculately, they still say that somehow only retroactively through Christ, through the merits of Christ's atonement. And so that raises the question: how can she be co-redemptrix when
Well, now you're
there's
doing
sort of
theology, Cal.
Yeah.
Now you're
And
doing
actually,
theology.
technically, co-redemptrix, as much as the trad Catholics like it, is actually not like the Pope has resisted.
Well, I thought I found a
But
resolution. I thought I found an interesting answer to this line of reasoning. In other words, this is treated as a reductio ad absurdum.
mhm.
I find it interesting, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the contrasts that it affords. A kind of, I don't know if you can indulge me in a certain hypothetical line of reasoning, because you can ask how it is that she's co-redemptrix if all the initiative lies on the side of Christ.
Right.
And Jason was telling me the other day about naming, and I don't remember. Does Adam name the woman? I can't remember. If he does, that's quite serious. But even little boy babies, they label more than girls. In the novel Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, the judge, who's basically the devil, says whatever exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. And conversely, to name something is to really finitize it and gain power over it, even if it's only a false kind of manipulative power. But little boy babies, they label, they name. And but see, earlier you and I, Nate, were talking about sort of the difference between when we play God and when God plays God, or in this context, you might say when you and I label and when God labels your names. I thought at the end of all this, I thought when I was praying the rosary and this question came into my mind, that if she's co-redemptrix, it's because he names her as it, and that in a similar way, not an exactly similar way necessarily, but we're all named by Christ. We're all selected to have a special role in the formation of his kingdom, and that's like the Whitestone name. But anyway, I'm sorry if this is not terribly coherent right now.
Well, no. Well, the angel names her Karakakatomine, which is it's actually a proper noun. It's a title of address, and it usually gets translated as "full of grace" into English, but it has a lot of layers of meaning beyond that.
Well, then you can get into the whole idea of grace as energies, which is God himself, actual God, right? Yeah.
So, I didn't know we would talk about Marian theology today. I suppose. Well,
I don't know anything about Marian theology. I'm not Catholic. And
I think that
I'm a
you
Oh,
very
know
come on.
a
Orthodox,
ridiculous
like
amount.
Orthodox don't have Marian theology? Give me a
I'd say
break.
that's what I'm saying. I don't know what the Orthodox theology is. I
Oh, I
just
see.
know
I see.
the Matins,
Well,
and I
let
know what I
us
learned through participating in Matins about
let,
Mary,
let me
and
say
that's all
oh,
personal revelation for me.
I
right.
want
I
to
don't.
hear that. I think that's real.
Yeah, me too. Lay it on us, Sherry.
Well, that's exactly what I was talking to Cal about at the beginning. Was that I realized that Mary tethers us to the earth, like
Mm-hmm.
growing up in a total depravity state of mind. My earthly existence was something that I needed to get away from. Right, I'll fly away. So I grow up essentially as a Gnostic Christian, right? Detesting my body, detesting my passions, detesting the earth as cursed and fallen. And this is just coming from me, okay? Like I'm not making any broad brush statements here, but this is how that theology worked itself out in my mind. And I had to learn to love myself, to love creation. And when I did, and this is apart from the Orthodox Church, I discovered that I was actually more and more in love with God. And then I decided to become an Orthodox Christian after many, many years of wandering around in the wilderness, literally. And then I met Mary, and I couldn't understand the importance of the Theotokos in the liturgy in Orthodox Christianity, but I decided that I would be open for it. And so I opened myself to it, and then I realized that this is what makes my humanity just as valid and significant as Christ's divinity, okay, is Mary. My humanity is not minderwertig, as the Germans would say. It's not undervalued, right? It doesn't have less worth than Christ's divinity. It's actually, if we're moving towards theosis, then both of those things are equally important. And this is why I think that we have to understand what Steiner and Bach are getting at when they talk about bridling the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic. I think we have to stop seeing demons everywhere. I think we have to be more optimistic about the journey that we're on. And yeah. And now I hope Kezzy is able to stay. Hello.
Hey.
That's amazing, Sherry. That helps me understand a
Welcome.
lot. I'm going to think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. The only thing I would want to add is that Mary has always been associated with the church. Like any of Christ that is a body, the physical human fleshly body comes from Mary directly, right? And the church is
Christ's humanity.
and the church is called the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And the ultimate conception of the church is necessarily cosmic. So that means that the literal body of the new creation in the cosmic sense comes from Mary. It's matter restored. And matter is linked directly to the idea of mother. So she's literally the mother of us all.
Kezzy, do you have a dog? I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Hezzy's
You're
on
muted,
mute.
Hezzy.
Sorry. First off, I don't have a dog. Secondly,
Okay.
hi Sherry, hi Nate,
Hi.
and hi Cal. I hope all's well, and I hope you guys had a wonderful weekend.
It's amazing you could recognize me through my disguise.
Well, who else would be Mr. Cool Man?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I maybe sound like I've smoked too many cools, and so I'm for that reason I'm intrigued by the fact that you recognize my voice still. So, but yes,
I'm
I
just
thought you had.
happy.
Do you really smoke cools?
I used to smoke like 4 years ago or something,
I
but
used to
I
smoke. I
quit.
actually used to smoke cools once upon a time. I was a menthol
You were cool.
smoking guy.
I'm wishing you a speedy recovery, Cal. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I saw on the Voxer that you happened to jump on, so I know it's a holiday if you're engaging at this capacity. So again, so
Oh
thank
my
you.
goodness, which is 0%. I stayed up like all night. And you know, I just my life. My son, he has to get therapy a lot, like all day. You know, if we can get it, and for his developmental disabilities. And I work a lot. I work in special education. I was working in that previously. There's lots of paperwork because anything to do with the government is, you know, if it's through a school, then it's just tons of paperwork. And I work as long as I can, and I still am not on top of it. And that's just what it is. And I think also there's maybe kind of a generational split in our voice chats where the millennials sort of congregated around Jason to an extent, and the it's not just generational because Luke is kind of in between millennial and Gen X, but I feel like there might be a slight like millennial Gen X kind of generational self-selection that has happened, but really, if I had more time, I would be back on the Voxer, kind of like in the old days. But stuff
Shwaya,
happens later
shwaya. Take your
What
time.
on.
So, Chezi, I have a question for you. Since yesterday was Shabbat, did you meet your additional soul? And did you have any personal revelations? Because I want to hear about
Oh,
it.
that sounds like a guardian angel to me. Additional soul.
First of all, that's a beautiful that's a beautiful question. So yes, unfortunately, now I'm back in the office, just because there's been a lot of work. So usually I would never really come to the office Saturday night to sort of see out the queen properly. Unfortunately, tonight I double booked, so I need to do some work. Having said that, it was a fantastic Sabbath. I was actually thinking a lot about this Voxer and this community because this weekly portion we're deep diving into the tabernacle and all the nitty gritty details, how wide the planks are, and such. So, however, this also has like the narwhal skin or the tachash skin that's called that's
Yeah.
supposed to be on top, and this relates to the garments of skin again, and also the boundary between what's inside and what's outside. There's a Talmud tractate that talks about was it a animal or sort of trying to define what this being is. And Rabbi Cook talks about the skins being representative of the other worldly religions, which is sort of it allows for sort of different interpretation once it leaves the inner sanctum and makes its way out. And that's why the Talmud is trying to figure out, like, if it's a wild beast, then it's something that we can't contend with. However, if it's used domesticated, and by domesticated means is it a religion or is it a manifestation of something that is natural and that sort of God will let it sort of run its course. So it was just interesting at that level. There's another level of interpretation, which is if you break down all the specific pieces, it comes out to be like around 613 pieces, which are indicative of the 613 mitzvahs, which is supposed to again be that the tabernacle, that's a physical manifestation. However, there's a spiritual tabernacle within each of us, and we have to realize how also we orient that. So I was just, this is very apropos the things we discuss over here. Having said that, my eyes, unfortunately, were darkened by, I see Jacob talking about the Amalekites, and I see that Nate, apparently you're an enemy now. No, so that
I
that
am Amalek. Yeah.
Tell us. for the sake of the audience, tell us about the Amalekites. Tell us what that means.
Well, this really dovetails with a conversation that. Well, let me take a step back. First off, I don't think Nate is the Amalekite. So if that carries any water, that's number one.
I didn't think I was either.
And it is unfortunate and curious that Jacob would use such terminology. I think Kale also spoke about some stuff in the Voxers that could be reasons for that. But Amalek in general, it's a question because this, I was saying, dovetails to how literally you take the Bible and Nate's question with evil. And are we looking at Nate has a very hard time with Yosef and I looking at these verses as being literal. And having a relationship with a God that could do that. And I saw Jed was coming in with different answers, how, that this was something that was necessary during the development of a nation, and God had to sort of meet the human spirit and the human tendencies where they were at that time, even while there's constantly a request to elevate. These are still things that we have to deal with. And Nate, I would just point out that has to do, obviously with the sacrifice as well. Just even having an actual sacrifice that you're going to bring to the temple. This is also just curbing different desires and impulses that these early Israelites had, all the way to even dealing with a captive of war, right? There's the Torah discusses, what do you do if you find a woman in the battlefield and you want to bring her back? So obviously in today's society, we would say absolutely not. That's immoral. At the time, the Torah was trying to massage the morality into it. So if you're going to take her, you have to shave her head and you can't touch her for 30 days and you have to let her cry at her father. And the idea was really to, if any of this was just due to the heat of battle, that we want to make sure everything, the Torah wants to do everything it can so you realize your mistake and then just let this woman go. And if after the end of these 30 days and you realize that this is just like this true love that you had to, so clearly the Torah was trying to deal with that. So on one hand, there might be a literalist reading to this verse, which is the affront that these people had, again, attacking the weak and what they stood for at the time, Amalek, which is really a group of a murderous tribe that would identify and attack the weak groups of the desert, and specifically after the exodus of Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea, and what that was supposed to sort of send a message to the world. It being attacked, the Israelites being attacked, was like an affront to God, which couldn't stand. Having said that, over the years, that clearly has gone through different interpretations, and today it is the view is that this is talking about a spiritual evil, and one that needs to be wiped out. There's conversations of the Amalek being inside of you, the voice inside of you that is challenging yourself. It's sort of sometimes easier to even point out your own faults, but very hard for you to genuinely recognize your own attributes and your own strengths. And the Amalek many times is like the interior part of you that is challenging you and telling you that you really can't surmount these difficulties. So in today's day and age, that's how we would look at Amalek, as a evil spirit that wants destruction. It doesn't manifest necessarily in an individual or in a people. It's an idea that could spread. Now, from the 2 minutes I heard of Jacob's video, and then I got onto this, he was claiming that Nate's disapproval of the quote unquote foundation organization was, I don't know, I guess he saw that as horrible and devastating. And I'll listen to what he had in mind.
So,
but yeah.
Just a couple points of clarity. Actually, I'm the one who brought up, it wasn't Jed, it was actually I challenging myself that brought up the idea that if God chooses a people, violence is automatically. If God actually chooses a people, you're going to have to accept that violence is going to be a consequence of that, like because of what it means to be a people. So I actually said that in challenging my own view. I said that.
Wow, Nate.
And so, and then the other thing I wanted to say is that, I lost Hezzy.
maybe got a phone call.
Uh-oh. Well, I'll hold the thought. I'll hold the second part of that for now.
Yeah.
When
he gets a phone call, he just disappears.
He just vanishes.
Yeah.
This business.
Oh, there he
I'm
is.
sorry.
I can't tell if he's ready to come back. Oh, there he is. Okay,
sorry.
Cool.
Sorry. Go
no
ahead.
problem. So the other thing is, like, I wanted to talk about. I didn't attack the foundation. That's not what I said. I attacked the idea of having foundation approved conversations. That's what I didn't like, because what I responded, my actual response with the thing that led to him calling me Amalek was Grim posted on Twitter a link to a video that he had that was, and he tagged it as foundation approved, just chatting. And I said, foundation approved, ... count me out. Because that's what I don't want. Like, that there is a foundation I have no problem with. That the foundation is going to be responsible for approving or disapproving what is talked about within this little corner, I have a serious problem with. And I don't think that's building anything. I actually think that threatens to divide and destroy.
I think that might have just been a poorly expressed thing on Grimm's part, you know.
I think Grim,
I don't think there's
Grim
any disapproval.
Grim knows I follow him. Grim knows my orientation. I think Grim wanted some fireworks there. I really do. I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it yet. But it's possible that Grim knew that there would be fireworks and was okay with that, being some fireworks.
I think it's important to stress that, first off, you guys all have interacted with Jacob for a few years right now, so it's always good to say certain things with
he's
the grain.
Never talked to me. He's never talked to me.
No, I understand that. I'm saying
we've never had one real conversation. We have only exchanged messages through text-based communication and occasional Twitter interactions. That is it. And it's pretty obvious that he doesn't know me. And the version, and I can't get too upset about what he's doing, because the version of me that he's attacking is a caricature of me that he's invented in his head. He doesn't know me at all.
First, he's not part of this organization and this foundation. Okay, so that was his whole move. Now, why I could see him having a hard time sort of like letting go of his baby, he, ultimately speaking, is not part of that organization, which, again, I think we're using sort of general terms over here, because this thing really hasn't manifested into anything yet. Now, your concern, your concern about this Grimm's line about that this was a foundation approved conversation, I hear how that sort of doesn't land well, that we have this organization now that is approving or disapproving. Now, you have to realize, no one knew about this conversation. It didn't go through anywhere. No one saw that we're having a conversation on Monday. Having said that, I could still hear your point saying, well, these are even, we don't even want to see these kind of jokes around. There he is. There's Grim. We don't even want to hear these jokes around.
Can anyone try? I don't know what IKR means.
Oh, right? Is that what it is?
That's right.
I'm thinking. But I don't know. I never know what these things are.
All right.
Nate, I think the move is to not, I know this sounds ridiculous, is to not respond. Like, you'd say, I don't want to not respond to a crazy claim I'm an Amalekite. I think that's very rude in a space like this, where we're trying to have this very open, loving, understanding conversation. And I don't I don't think you have in any way, in any interaction I've had with you, I never heard any I never had any reason to think that you want, quote unquote, the destruction of this,
No.
little corner or whatever they say. So I really don't know where he's coming from. My recommendation is just
Honestly,
don't
Hezzy,
engage.
if you
Water
hadn't
under
brought
the
it up, we'd already decided not to talk about it.
Oh, so
Sherry-
sorry. So forget
So
this.
it's okay.
I don't even know what we're talking about.
Sherry talked me down this morning. I actually I put on the Darth Vader shirt on purpose this morning.
Ooh.
And it's like, oh, if I'm going to be cast as the villain, I'll come on and I'll play the villain.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say you're really Jake. I thought you were saying you're really Jacob's father.
No.
And I was like, okay,
Oh, that's so good.
it's a twist.
That is good.
Um,
Hezzy.
But so putting Jacob aside for a moment,
See?
putting Jacob aside, then,
I told you.
and again, I'm just taking advantage. Kale's here, so Kale, tell us your wisdom, tell us your secrets.
Oh, I have no wisdom. But you guys keep this pertains to the Amalekites, and it pertains to it sounds like a difference of scriptural interpretation that Nate
Mhm.
had with Yosef, but that which Nate is also trying to work through by posing questions that challenge his own interpretation or position. And again, just forgive my poor connection as I try to stumble through this, but this is a very interesting theological question, a very difficult theological question pertaining to the difference between what God wills and what he allows, and the way in which what he allows is ultimately part of his will. And so, you might say God has, well, the way that I used to look at it was like, God has a left hand and a right hand. He doesn't have two right hands. It's not that everything that happens is his positive will. And yet there is that way that because he's omniscient and all powerful, he doesn't have the excuse that you and I have when something happens halfway around the world and someone gets murdered in China, and I say, hey, Hezzy, how come you didn't stop that murder in China? And you say, I didn't know it happened. Even if I had known, there was nothing I could have done. God has neither of those excuses. There's no difference between what he wills and what he allows. Did any of that come through clearly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
That's like kind of that would be the position of people who ultimately side in favor of a kind of like this is also actually David Bentley Hart kind of makes a version of of that argument in favor of universalism. So you can actually find several iterations of that, but I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong because it misunderstands the nature of what God's power is. And I think that you have to understand that God's power simply is love. God's power is not different from what his essence is.
Yeah, but you could say that that love is being interpreted or felt at different levels,
Absolutely.
right? So
you could say that. Oh, I'm sorry, Kenzie. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I was just saying that love could be felt as even hate at some level of interpretation.
Well, that love allows great violence and trauma to occur. There's no two ways around that.
Correct.
And it's ultimately out of love that it allows it, which is very hard for us to understand.
Not really. I think as a parent, you see it. You have.
Sherry, you're a saint. You have an unfair advantage. I'm talking about the rest of us.
No, I'm not. God. Saint Mary of Egypt was a saint, and she was probably a.
You know who says they're not saints,
Oh,
Sherry? You know who says they're not saints?
Saints.
Saints. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I'm painfully aware of the fact that I'm not. Okay.
Actually, it's funny. It's funny, Sherry. We actually had an argument once when I was and I was still an agnostic at the time, and I ended up. This is the position I took in the argument, though. The argument was over whether one should whether one should strive to be a saint or not. And an agnostic, I said no. I said because if you're striving to be a saint, you almost certainly won't become a saint.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, of course.
Nate, I want to jump back for a second, just back to this literalist reading, because I know you were saying how you were like shocked that like Yosef and I could be having like this interpretation of the Bible, and like you're like it just dawned on you that that was our thought process. So yes, there are many verses and there are many chapters that we could read as allegorical, but specifically after the splitting of the sea, there's terminology that's used. I shared this once in the Voxer, and then again, like in Psalms, about like God's a throne being identified for the first time, let's say in front of a people. And that's like that allowed for God to be recognized by this people. And in some sense, yes, he was playing around already with Moses and other characters, but not recognized as the God that he has planned out to be for the nation of Israel. And when the nation of Israel recognizes him, there's this bond that gets created. Later on, when the Amalekites attack again, there's this reference to his throne. And the extreme reaction to the Amalekites is again due to the fact that at that time, which is a very pivotal moment, there is God introducing himself onto the world scene in a certain version as the God of the Israelites, and Sorry.
Chessie, I just want to ask you quickly, don't you think that it's important for God to preserve his people? Like, isn't that a good reason? If these people
so you could say he's defending them. However, there was a requirement over here for a genocide, so to speak, right? Everyone, the kids, the children, everything. So there's like, so this is a lot more, let's say, intense. Like we could reconcile Hashem Tzevaot, one of his names, right? Like the war god, right? So like, you could say like this was happening at the time, but this genocide, what is this? So again, this is very much a symbolic response as well, which is there's not going to be any slavery, right? Which is there's removing the Israelites from slavery, and what that's supposed to send a message, and what the Amalekites stood for at that time, which is this evil which attacks the weak and attacks the groups that are sort of wandering in the desert, which it was identified by God and wanted us to identify it as well as complete evil that needs to be wiped out. Now, obviously, we still have to dance around that tension of like, okay, so that happened literally. How did that God make that requirement? My focus is though on the conceptual idea of that kind of evil needs to be rooted out completely, which is different than, you could eventually marry a Egyptian person, right? Even though those were the people that were captive, we were captive in Egypt. There's still you could have this intermarriage between Jew and Egyptian. However, the Amalekite always needs to be wiped out, which, just to stress, because Jacob was mentioning that's Purim, we see this again with Haman. Right, and Haman comes, and this is like a beautiful example of anti-Semitism. He goes to King Xerxes and tells him that there is this people, and they act differently, and they pray differently, and they just do things differently. Let's wipe them out. Let's get rid of them completely. The kids, the children, everything. And it's a response back to, again, not just personally on the Jews, but this is again where we identify this kind of evil that perks its head up, that wants complete devastation and annihilation, and our response is to that. So it could have started off as physically, but it's now spiritual.
Yeah, it's a totalizing system, right? It's the difference between a war for other reasons and a totalizing system, right? That just wants to, yeah, I see what you're saying. I like that comment by Grimm. The evil of natural selection. I've thought about this a lot because of, living where I live and how I live, and seeing, sometimes you see body parts in the woods, right? A rabbit or a grouse or something, and you think, "Oh, poor rabbit." But then you have to think, "Oh, well, if it hadn't been for that rabbit, whatever ate it would have died of starvation." Like, so, like this is why I don't have problems with the idea of God, and I don't even know how to phrase it, because he could probably do that for me better. and just the evil in the world, because yeah, I have a hard time expressing it, but I think Jordan Peterson said it well when he said, be careful of alleviating somebody else's suffering. Be careful of doing that. Right? Can't hear you, Chezi.
You're muted, Hezi.
That takes us back to Job, which we've discussed here multiple times. That his companions' answers, while theologically and philosophically might have been true, that was not relevant to Job at the time, and it was improper for them to engage him in that way, and that's not what he needed to hear. He needed to see God in a different experience. He had to really feel that, and you're not going to be able to sort of wash it away with answers, right? And that relates back to God's answer in a lot of these cases, which is silence, or he responds to the person asking, whether and most famously Moses, when he tells him be silent, like shtok. He tells him, like, just don't. This is what I thought of. And as a child, it's always been, I sort of love that answer, because I loved being told by God, like, far enough.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to understand. You're not going to understand this. So I very much, I enjoy, in a certain sense, being in that space.
I guess, like, for me, when I think about these things, I don't have the propositional capacity to explain it away. And I'm glad for that, because I don't think it can be explained away, but I see it all around me. Right. And in the natural world. And so there's a balance. There's a, like Matthias Desmet puts it, it's a complex dynamical system, and it appears irrational. Right. So, and I just have to, like you're saying, Chezi,
well,
you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it.
This relates a little also to, let's say, miracles, where in Judaism we also have a tradition where on the seventh day, when God stops, when God rests, that's when you would say nature and its natural order come into play. And there is the 6 days beforehand, which are still the days of tohu vavohu, which are still the days of chaos, which are pre-nature. And there is the natural way of things, which scientists do a fantastic job in identifying and exploring and uncovering, which is another way of seeing God's glory. However, that doesn't mean that things like evil or the divine or the miraculous are not still sewed into, let's say, the fabric of reality in a certain sense. However, they are covered in many layers of reality, which seem to us as miraculous or seem to us as not natural when they make their, when they surface, so to speak. Hey, Jed.
Hey.
Hi, Jedediah.
Good morning. Hey, Nate, I brought my Vader shirt too. Just solidarity. So.
Wow.
So this kind of makes me think about the garments of skin again, Pezzy, because my understanding is not, I would rather keep it mythological and call it Leviathan. Because I think Leviathan represents this complex dynamical system under which we have to abide, right? We find our abode underneath of it, within the tabernacle. Like, this is where we tabernacle, under it, literally, in the world. We are under that burden of this complex dynamical system. And sometimes, like there's that those verses in Job where it talks about eating Leviathan too, right? So not only are you living underneath of it, but you're also partaking, consuming it. Like this is, to me, this is very profound, actually. Very profound. I love it. Like, it says more to me than any other conversation you could have around it than the whole Doors of the Sea that I read from David Bentley Hart.
I love that book.
I know you do.
Did I ever tell you where I read that book for the first time?
You're getting some
you're-
feedback on your mic there, Jen.
You're garbly, actually.
Just a second. You guys can hear me, yeah?
That's better.
Yeah,
Now.
that's better.
Okay. So anyway, yeah, the first time I read Doors of the Sea, it was actually at the bedside of my son who has a heart condition. We had a day where we had to go in and have him. So I finished the book while I was in the hospital with my son while we were testing on his heart. It's definitely the right time to read the book.
Jed and Nate were having a discussion about the 144,000, the seal. I think you guys were having a discussion as well. So that was you guys were going. I mentioned this on the Voxer as well, and it's also ironic that Jacob would call you like a Amalekite, just because the amount of good faith I see when you guys are having this kind of conversation, and the struggle I could see you guys having when thinking your thoughts and trying to really, I mean, like really steel man as much as you can, like different positions. It's really beautiful to see. So again, I don't see in any way how there could be like I don't sense any bad faith happening. I just see like beautiful people trying to understand what God wants from them in the world. So having said that, Jed, and I hope this is not too uncomfortable, but this is like sort of the tension that I deal with in this channel, and it also relates to this quote unquote foundation that's starting, which is really what is the position of the Jews in like this little corner, and this is also true. What is the position of the Jews sort of to the world? Because right, so am I being seen? Yeah, like in the conversation you're having, I'm like, am I part of that 144? I understand that it's like it's symbolic, but it's because I don't see the future where it's only the Jews around. And it's interesting to see you guys sort of try to parse out where you guys fit in, the Israelites or the Jews, because I see since 1948, the Jewish state and the Jewish people just became like a theological problem for like a lot of people. Once like history represented itself in a certain extent, and
yeah, and
I don't know.
shocking ways too. I mean, if you think about that development, that's not like that wouldn't necessarily be an intuitive historical development. It's thrown a wrinkle for all Islam, Christianity, all the Abrahamic faiths have really had to grapple with the existence of the state of Israel, and a post-Holocaust world. It's hard to know exactly how to navigate, because you're not when you're and I hope I don't say anything horribly offensive here, Hezi, but it's hard to know how to engage in what I would say like religious or theological critique, and where that bleeds over into sometimes becoming more of an anti-Semitic position. And sometimes I think we as Christians, and I'm largely ignorant of modern Judaism, is we just don't know sometimes if we're where those boundary lines are drawn, and even if they're drawn in a way that is respectful and helpful.
I agree, and I think people, not to get too political, it's always a hard line to toe whether like criticism on Israel's policy, turns into anti-Semitism, or is that just like criticism on the political body. And this is a big tension between Jacob and I, because while I see the current political body God has a plan in general, but I don't see this as the manifestation of that, that I was dreaming about. And again, from a macro perspective, this is the most miraculous time ever. From a micro perspective, I see like many, many issues in the leadership where I don't think the Jewish story is not supposed to, we're not supposed to be impressing the world with that, you know, that we made like the disc on key technology or like cherry tomatoes. Like that's not our message. Like, while that's like very nice, I guess, it needs to be a different message than that. And we clearly are not, we're not oriented properly. But just for a moment to digress, like this is part of like the big tension that's happening right now in Israel. And there's like a lot of, political turmoil going on the streets right now, and there's a lot of demonstrations. And the reason that is because you have a split. It's a minority, but a loud minority in Israel that sort of wants Israel to be identified the way the rest of the world or the European world sees, you know, democracy. And I would say there's the majority in Israel, which is more conservative / religious, and they have a specific vision. Now, not all of them are as extreme to the right religiously, but how they observe the Passover and the Sabbath, and the whole culture in Israel is still very much embedded. That everyone has their sort of their own foundation story. Ours is still very much embedded and connected and tethered to the Bible. And anytime you sort of bring that up, the rest of the modern world sort of looks at you being like, well, why are you bringing this up again? Like, why are we dealing with like, oh, there's a certain there's a group of the population that is learning scriptures all day, and we have to like pay for their taxes and pay for their healthcare, and that is a big tension. And unless Israel decides for itself that that's the direction it wants, which is it's more, which is an awkward, like a Jewish democratic state, whatever that means, it's not going to be able to orient itself properly. And in a certain sense, I think the world is sort of anxiously looking at that, saying like, what are they going to do? How are these people going to manifest? Like, can it manifest as some sort of moral, religious / democratic nation that has like something to say, or could offer other religions, whether it's Buddhists or whether it's Christians or whether it's Muslims, how to do that, how to really dance that dance. Yeah. I don't know. We're not there yet.
Well, I think it's an interesting, you know, I'm not one of the, you know, one that I do think that Israel has a legitimate political stake in the land. Right. But I see them very much like, you know, kind of like maybe in that Jewish minority within Israel is like, I see them as struggling with some of the same promises and contradictions that any nation struggles with, you know. And so I think that it's, in that sense, there's what's exceptional about Israel is not necessarily that it's a nation state, you know, its people are exceptional, but I think that the nation state itself, to me, it seems like, you know, it's already kind of defined as a nation state in almost this post-Westphalian kind of.
He's so dispensationalist for a non-Christian. It's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like one of those things that I think that, you know, it's an interesting, that side is interesting to me. What, I guess, like, you know, since I got you here, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. And it kind of roots into my my own studies, and I'm wondering how you know, like, contemporary Jews handle their relationship to the land. I don't remember exactly how many times the term "the land" appears in the Hebrew Bible, but I know it's significant. I want to say over 500 times. All right, so it's extraordinarily significant in, you know, throughout the scriptures. What's very interesting is that term almost disappears in the New Testament. Like, there's almost no mention of the land at all. And in fact, I can't think.
Well, Jed, this connects directly to the conversation we were having on Revelation 7 about the distinct, like, the church is not a people, and you can't be a people without a land.
I'm still fuzzy on that one. I don't have any firm conclusions, because I think, like,
isn't there also the idea in the Hebrew scriptures of the God being bound geographically? There's something.
Yeah, Fredrickson has some scholarship on that. I mean, that's not peculiar to Judaism or Israel. Like, all.
No. It's just, yeah. ancient.
for God's
I-
territorial. At some level.
So Jed, my general response to that would be that, I've recommended this book before somewhere here, that the Origins of Jewish Consciousness by Eric Neumann. There's 2 volumes of this, which I definitely recommend. But there is like a triangle he sees between the people, God, and the land. And the land is really represented by the feminine, and the exile and the Torah, specifically the Talmud, and its development is more identified with the masculine. And the land is really a tether, which is why God is always very intense, less so about idol worship not in the land, but idol worship in the land itself can't happen. And the reason you need the land is because the people require, and this goes back to how one ties his shoes, or how one plants a tree, or how one, and again, to this weekly portion about the tabernacle, which is I'm jumping let me take a step back. There's the promise made to Abraham first, which is you're going to be, a great nation and a father of great nations, right? Ultimately, that gets distilled later on again with post Sinai. God is very much interested in creating a people, and this people needs to know. It ultimately matters how you guys relate with each other. So what happened if your ox hurts this other person's ox? And if you build a house, you have to have a fence on top in case someone doesn't fall, because it's all relational. And we build the tabernacle, and it happens again. These are slaves that were just left. And however, they're required all to donate to the building of the tabernacle, because again, this has to be something that you guys are going to build together, which allows you to do this. This ultimately manifests on the land, which this is required for you to realize how God manifests through everything. So it's going to have to be how he manifests through growing, through the blessings you make on food, and constantly you are tethering yourself. So you could say Jews in diaspora did this as well. Herman Cohen, for example, was a very big believer that we're not supposed to be tethered to the land, that the Jews are supposed to be wandering and supposed to be manifesting his destiny as a mini little Israel without all the different places he is. However, I think most Jewish scholars believe that the land is very much necessary, because this is where we're it's not the double entendre, but grounded. Because you could keep these things very spiritual. However, there has to be a place where this work manifests. So where you build your house, and then that house, literal and metaphorical roots need to make their way through. And the physical roots, you then lay on top of them another layer of spirituality, which you realize that not only am I spiritually connected to God, I'm also physically, and then again, spiritually connecting through God throughout these things. So I would say that the land is extremely important. And while a church could be a certain model of that, which is sort of like a land, it's sort of like, I don't want to, like, just because we're talking about Star Wars references, it's sort of like the Cloud City, where Lando lives. So like, this is a land that is like out there in space. However, it's not connected to, it's not tethered to the actual ground. So yes, I could drink water there. Sorry, please go ahead.
I'm just going to interrupt you really quick, Cassie, because I just want to say this connects right back to what I was talking about, the Theotokos. Even the
Thank
same
you.
language.
I was going to go there if you didn't, Sherry.
Even the same language, tethering, grounding, right? Earth, dust of the earth, all that's like so interesting. I don't know if you heard it, Cassie, but I don't have to reiterate it. But anyway, continue. I just wanted to.
Well, and she is represented in Revelation chapter 12. She is represented as Israel.
I would mention also, Jed, that just because you're mentioning again the earth. So Adam's name, Adamah, right? But his wife is not named Eve, or right. Ishti is not named Admati. She's not named like Adami, or like, that's because he sees her, again, this is a joint thing that he did together with God. He recognizes the earthly part of himself, but then defines her differently, because this is like a separate creation, so to speak. And we do this again with the naming of the animals. And for us to be part of this creation with God, it requires us to And some of that happens with the logos, with the word, where we take a concept and then we could actually manifest that. But that also has to be not only embodied, but also practiced out there in the world. So
interesting.
Which is also.
Can I back up on one thing there, just because you made mention to Adam and Eve?
After this,
Sure.
I have one question I want to ask.
What's interesting to me is the more I read Bulgakov and the sociology, and what I find interesting is, Eve's name is a derivative of life. The wordplay in Hebrew, I forget how to pronounce the term, so I won't butcher it. But the tree of life and Eve essentially share the same name, right? When Adam names Eve, and so I see like it just reinforces what you're saying is like she is the echo of that tree of life that was lost. She's the echo of Sophia in creation, of wisdom and life beyond the duality of good and evil. And so I think it's kind of an interesting concept that the feminine plays from the very beginning, and I think that there's the reason why I asked, like you use the cloud city, I would say there's a sense where an exiled people are more like the Asgardians after Thor Ragnarok, right? But the what's interesting, and there's an Old Testament theologian. I don't even know if he's still living, but I followed him quite closely. He wrote a fantastic article on the relationship between in the New Testament, how the New Testament deals with the concept of the land, right? And so the New Testament deals with the concept of the land, all of the blessings the abundant blessings that come with life in the promised land that the Hebrew Bible is pointing to are taken up and spiritualized as those blessings are now for the believer in Christ are in Christ, right? And so in a sense, he was making an argument that Christ was a fulfillment, not the final fulfillment, because I think that the land promise was still obtained. Like I do think that as well, but that there is a way for a people in exile, a people without a land, to experience the blessings of the land, right? Of spiritual abundance. And so I'm wondering if there's any maybe comparative concept within contemporary or even ancient Judaism that deals with how do they deal with the problem of exile, and what does that look like, and do some Jews still see themselves as in exile? Maybe I know that not every Jew is a Zionist, so that's just a question I have for you.
That's a fantastic question, but Nate, take it away.
I have two questions.
I have one thing. I have to excuse myself. So, and I didn't want to just disappear on you all because the land is calling me.
Oh, yes.
The snow is piling up and I need to go shovel out my sheep. But if you guys are still here later, I'll check back and maybe I'll join again.
Okay.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you, by the way.
Okay, so one of my questions is more for Jed and myself to try to wrestle with, and the other one is for Hezi. So the first question is like, is the Holy Land holy because it's the Holy Land, or is it holy because of the presence of God's chosen people? That's the first question. That's more for Hezi to answer. And then the question for us is like, what is the connection between our own the ending of our own New Testament revelation in the New Jerusalem, and what is the connection between New Jerusalem and Jerusalem? Is it only symbolic and metaphorical, or does it also somehow represent the actual physical location of Jerusalem? And that makes me think about like both Catholic and Orthodox traditions that Golgotha was actually above the original temple, so that in fact above the altar directly. So maybe there is an actual correspondence with the literal earthly place, even in the image of the New Jerusalem. It's an open question. So Hezi, if you wanted to try to answer the question I had for you, and Jed, if you want to wrestle after Hezi's done, we can try to wrestle with that New Jerusalem question.
I think it also relates to Jed's question, sort of like how some Jews sort of see exile and how they see the land. So like you said, Jed, the land is mentioned a tremendous amount of time, obviously, like inside the Old Testament. Ironically, what's also mentioned almost as much is our relationship with the Gentile living in the land, which is always like a tension because Israel's dealing with that right now. But well, yes, there are some that see the fact that they see the exile as still lasting right now. They're still in exile, and Jacob gave like a whole like a three streaming like a series about this, but that it's not manifest, and it's only manifest when God wants it so, and like would have to see like signs, and like everyone would come together. However, the quote unquote Zionist movement, and I'm separating Zionists from, let's say, political Zionist movement. So the religious Zionist movement sees, many of these promises being fulfilled, like are indicative of like the actual, whether it's the 6-day war, whether like the Bible talks about the elderly sitting in the streets of Jerusalem watching their kids play, and like that happened like this Sabbath, like to me, and like the old people walking around. So everyone sort of sees that as very real, and like it definitely, when you walk the streets of Jerusalem over here as a religious person, you very much feel like you're walking in the Bible, whether it's like the land you're actually walking on, because these are the places that are located and we're told about in the Bible, and because you're seeing sort of this growth, right? Or people see the Ezekiel's, the dried bones, a revelation that he had as the Jewish people coming out from the concentration camps, and like those dried bones making their way back into the global world again and coming back to Israel. So again, that carries like a lot of weight. And for people thinking about Moses' request to see God, you'll only see the back of me, right? Seeing the God of history. When you're looking at that from that point of view, you're like, wow, like I'm seeing like this thing sort of like map out across, and that obviously is extremely impressive. So most people would see this exile as, or what they call this term right now as the birthing pains of redemption, is what the status is Israel's out, or the sparks or the little identifications of redemption, the redemption times, but we're not fully there yet. There are ultra Orthodox communities that may live even in Israel, but completely defy the state, as in they have generators, they're not connected to the grid, they want to have nothing to do with the secular concept of the state, which also relates to the first thing you said about like, as a nation state, do you see that as like sort of the divine manifestation of the Israeli people? I don't see this version of it. However, I see it manifesting itself politically, because when we come into the land, God says, if you'd like to have a king like the nations around you, and like it doesn't have to be democracy, but there has to be a way that we orient ourselves, and that is going to have to be recognized by the people around us. And in this current culture that we live in, that game is called politics, and the best game in town is called democracy. So that's sort of how I see how we have to engage with the world. So and just one last note, back to the feminine and the masculine, we call the Talmud, or sages much greater than I, call the Talmud the great band-aid of exile, right? So this is something, and back to the floating city, when you're in the floating city, there are a lot of things that you could have conceptually, but if you flick a rock and it breaks a window, clearly the whole spaceship is in trouble right now. Yeah. So then you have a lot of different regulations and rules that start building this exoskeleton called Judaism over 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. The return to the land allows us in a certain extent to like, take off that exoskeleton and mm-hmm. come back to a lot more embodied version of that religion. But I think you need a land for that. It can't happen in this cloud city, and it can't happen in this just theoretical understanding of God. Yeah. It needs to be embodied in the land.
Huh. Interesting. Nate, do you mind just kind of circling back to the question you asked, so that I make sure that I'm
Yeah. So the question I asked Hezi, which he was just answering, I think he kind of evaded directly answering my direct question.
No intention. If I did, I'll get back in it.
Or at least you gave a roundabout answer. Let's let me put. I didn't mean to make it sound negative. Like, what you said was beautiful, and and very learned and thoughtful. But my direct question was: is the land holy because the land is holy, or is land holy because of the presence of the chosen people? Which it's a sort of a chicken and egg kind of question.
I think the land. Okay, so there are plenty of people that will say the land was holy, and where Mount Moriah, where Isaac was and Jacob did that, that's like where the Temple Mount was built, and 1,000 different versions of like why that's the land, and like on the Temple Mount there's like the source rock where all the world came from. Okay, I can't tell you if that's true or not. I think there was a God selecting a land in that specific place. I think that has to do with, again, God finds Abraham, or that's the terminology he used. He says, like, I found this guy walking around, and like I identified, there's other people I identified earlier on, but I found someone that specifically wanted to make sure, God says, like, I chose him because he was going to teach his kids. And he's going to follow this through. That's why I'm going to follow through with this guy, because I had Melchizedek and I had Enoch, but these were individuals. I've identified someone that realizes in some way the kind of conversation that my being, or what we call Elohim, he recognizes that the Arenic God is in play, and he wants to connect to that. And he wants to continue that with his kids and his offspring. So I'm going to identify a land for these people. And he says, now go to this land. Now, where this land is located, I think some of it has to do with Egypt and Babylon and the great nations of that time that were playing the theological games and trying to understand God. So I think, hence, that's happening in this neighborhood.
Well, let's talk about like what is the difference between, because the Eden is also described as if it were geographically somewhere in the Middle East, right?
Right.
Like, that's how it's described. So what is the connection between Holy Land and Eden?
Well, I think Eden, and this also relates to sort of like in the world to come. I think there might be there might be a world to come, which is a conscious experience, where like there's not this embodied experience, like we don't know what that means or what happens later on. However, creating heaven on earth, which sounds sort of like a Hallmark card, that is possible, and that could be happening in your house, in my house, in everyone's house, or in everyone's. But that requires sort of full orientation. And I've said this many times, from the individual all the way, community, family, neighborhood, people, the whole nation, the whole world. So that's what heaven on earth looks like. And I don't think like, heaven is going to be located like take 4 turns and take a right and it's over there if you pass too far. It's heaven is and hence the whole story of Adam and Eve is allegorical, right? That's not the conversation we're having. The conversation we're having, like, how do we go back to that mindset? How do we go back to that place? Which, if you don't mind, I'm digressing, but hopefully to make a point. When Isaac wants to bless Jacob and Esau, right? Like, we need to ask, like, why was he thinking that the blessing should go to Esau? Like, we're told that he's a problematic person, he's raping, he's killing. Like, why no one around the neighborhood said, like, Isaac, your younger son, Jacob, he's like really the one you want to be giving like this major blessing for. Or at least his mom would say something. So the beginning of that story starts with that Isaac's eyes were darkened or blind, and the reverse of that is the conversation we have with Adam and Eve when they eat from when they sin and their eyes opened up. And there's something about Isaac going through the experience of the sacrifice and being okay doing this, which required him to go to like a pre-sin state where he doesn't recognize this good and evil anymore to a certain extent. And that's why he can't see the difference between Jacob and Esau. And, that difference is like sort of completely been blurred to him. And once he realizes what happened, he has this terrible fear. So I think there is something about us allowing ourselves to have an experience where we could go back to Eden. but that requires us to have a certain understanding, both physical and spiritual and cognitive, where we realize sort of where we are. So I don't think it's a physical specific location. I think it's everywhere.
Mm. That's so interesting because I mean, as I kind of look into, and I have these strange experiences. I don't want to explain too much here, but when I see like whether that's in the prophets, the writings of the prophets, as far as what their kind of their eschatological, you could say imagination or revelations are, right? How they're seeing that state where, wolves and babies and, are together, right? Wolves and cobras and babies and all these kinds of things. Is I see that there's a sense where, I would say like the millennium, let's just put it that way. The whole earth becomes the land, right? And maybe the Holy Land itself becomes kind of the focal point of kind of like the inner sanctum of the temple, right? So I do see like in a sense, the restoration of Israel coincides with the restoration of the world, right? I don't see it as a.
So let's circle back to my New Jerusalem question, because I think we have to see that what actually happens at the end of Revelation for us is not it's the beginning. It's not really the end. It's like the beginning, right? Because you're only given because you're not actually I mean, it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, yes, but you're only given the image of the New Jerusalem, right? And so my question is like, well, the New Jerusalem so it's kind of like it's the antithesis of Babel, right? Because it's a city that comes down from heaven, as opposed to, a tower that's being erected from earth to heaven. So it's like the inverse of Babel. Oh, you're muted, Hezi. Go ahead.
Yeah, just Nate, just to say just about that line, and you continue saying that it comes down from heaven, the third temple, right? So like it's never a structure that comes down from heaven. Rather, it comes down from the higher places of consciousness, where we could grab these ideas and bring them down.
And the arrival of the New Jerusalem is connected to the singing of the new song by the same exact 144,000 that Jed and I were talking about. So that suggests to me, if the 144,000 does in fact properly refer to the Jewish people, as I think it does, and it is the Jewish people that are singing the new song, then there rightfully has to be a connection with the actual Jerusalem to the arrival of the New Jerusalem from heaven.
But I would just ask, it's like because Jed was saying, well, first of all, yes, I'd agree with that. Yes, about the new song. There's talks about like there's going to be an eighth note when that day comes. However, there's also I'm saying historical context of Jesus or the New Testament not talking about the land so much because they were in the land.
Well, I mean, to a degree, but I mean, I think like the New Testament, like you're seeing kind of like the writing of the New Testament is also probably beginning to coincide with a lot of the tensions that we're building, post crucifixion, between the crucifixion and the destruction of the temple, is you have a lot of people leaving the land because things are getting hot, right? I mean, there was a lot of, so they were kind of in a sense joining the diaspora, I think is a good way of viewing that, is people, and Jesus says that, like, you'll go to Jerusalem, Samaria, and the uttermost ends of the earth. I think in a sense, he's just telling him the way it's going to go. It's not so much even just a command. It's just like, it's a declaration of the reality, I think, that they're going to have to face. And I think that Jesus doesn't, if you look at the context in which his ministry is happening, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the temple's in peril and it could end up getting destroyed, even from his vantage point 40 years before it happens, right?
Yes, and the prophets also, I mean, the prophets warn constantly, right, that like, this is coming down. I mean, in a certain sense, this is also why the prophecy ends at that point, because the prophecy was a fail. We couldn't, those lofty ideas it didn't mesh with the people. And the Talmud talks about how a wise man or a chacham or a sage is preferable than a prophet, because ultimately then they realize, and Ezra is the one that sees this, that there needs to be a system. There needs more regulations. There needs to be something that they really understand, because the prophet coming up on high and leaving his mountain, or Elijah coming and being like, pissed off at everyone, it wasn't working. However, part of that new song, and I see this as part of, like, I even see Grail Country as a manifestation of this. This is, I hope, the bubbling up of the prophetic tendency. This is that kind of conversation, and I hope, due to the achievements of philosophy and science up until this point, that kind of conversation blended with prophecy is what that kind of new song sounds like. I'm in no way claiming to I've heard such a conversation. I've been part of such a conversation. I'm just saying that is what I look at these conversations working towards. And again, it's hard for me when I get to see Jordan Peterson speaking, and in no way is he a prophet, but I get to see him speaking in Jerusalem, telling me how, like, we're the chosen people. And it just sounds very strange. It sounds very, it looks very biblical for someone sitting in like the Holy Land, having sort of hearing this kind of conversation. And one last line about that is, while Jesus or the Gospels talk about sort of leaving the land, the Levites at the rivers of Babylon that didn't sing the song, right? That we learned that they chopped off their thumbs to not allow themselves even to play their violins, because they said we could only do this back on the land.
Yeah, interesting. If something kind of comes up, and I think that there's a profound irony if you look at, like, the history of the church. One of the things that we've spent the better part of 2,000 years, and we even look at this in terms of Nate's interviews with Jordan, right? I don't know if you've seen, like, Jordan's book on the whole mystery of Christ. Is we have been thinking into the implications of the incarnation now for 2,000 years, and one of the things that, if you take the incarnation seriously, one of the direct implications is that God is a Jew.
Again, sorry.
That God is a Jew. He's incarnated as Jesus. So that, from the Christian perspective, there's a in a sense, we're still
Jensen is very clear on this. Like, he spends a great deal of time, like, talking about that.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a particularity that in Jesus's own life and ministry on earth that is forever stamped in his identity as as a Christian would say, as the incarnate God, which is Jewish.
But his identity is the identity of identity and non-identity, as you would know from reading Jordan's book.
And he's the identity, and he's also the identity of the Gentiles, of the nations as well.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if he's Jewish. I mean, like, but I do see, and this relates to the seal you guys were having, and within relation to the seal in the Gospels, that could be relating to, like, the seal of circumcision. That could be relating to the seal. I heard you mention the seal that the high priest wore on his head. I mean, only the high priest wore that. However, there is the seal of God says, like, I'm a fiery seal on your heart and a fiery seal on your arm as well. There's the seal of the phylacteries that we wrap around our arm, and we wrap around our head as well.
And the seal is both positively and negatively interpreted, right? So the seal is very much representative of the phylacteries, but also the mark of the beast. The false one as well indicates the true law, the true Torah, and maybe a false interpretation of Torah.
Well, it could, again, I would say it could be potentially both. So, and this is like, I'm at the edge of what I think would be potentially considered like heresy. But I think, again, Rabbi Cook talks about how there is Moses's Torah and there is Messiah's Torah. And eventually there is a difference between those two. And I wouldn't equate Moses' Torah, which I believe to be eternal, as the beast. However, there is a sense, and relating to what the prophets talk about, that God never told your forefathers that he wanted sacrifices, right? Like when they left Egypt, like that wasn't the requirement. And yet this is something that you're doing right now, and I don't like the way you guys are going about it. So I think there is something about the ones who carried the seal, which is like sort of a badge of honor, which is like, we've been carrying your word all this time. And like, I do sense in a certain way, like Jews go alongside history. And there's like the history that's happening, and there's our how Jews sort of interact with history that whole way, which is they're carrying that seal of, let's say we'll call it the seal of truth. However, its current interpretation of that seal, like you need to rip off a lot of layers until you get to that seal. So there, you could even, in this case, look at that interpretation of the beast, which is at times the seal bearer could manifest itself or look beastly, because it seems like it's not wearing the seal properly, or it's not representing the seal properly. So I guess you could be looking at both of them, the positive and the negative, as the same person.
Yeah, Grim, I do not see the vaccination as any way connected with the mark of the beast, by the way. I think
is that supposed to be like because Israel like started like the whole vaccines? Like it's like
I don't know. I don't see.
No, I think no, I think the argument that he would make to try to steel man Grim here is that it was in fact used to essentially rob people of their economic autonomy, and it did in fact become connected to your ability to buy and sell.
Totally.
So that's I think that's the argument that he would make, and I would say that he's right in seeing like some echoes of something dark in that. It's definitely like the way it came down was like pretty authoritarian and awful, and but I don't think it's the mark. I would agree with you there ultimately, Judd.
Right. I mean,
but Grim's not seeing nothing though.
No, that's here's my problem with it, and I hope, Grim, that this is respectful, because I'm not trying to be totally contrarian. My problem with it is that when we load these kinds of things with the kind of apocalyptic freight that kind of we leverage that and say, well, this is the mark of the beast, it's evil, therefore XYZ, we must respond in a certain way. I think it removes the importance of our own worldly and political engagement. I do agree that the way that the vaccines were rolled out were draconian and actually not very helpful, right? And did a tremendous amount of damage. So I'm not criticizing that. I'm with you on that. But I don't think that it meets the preconditions of what the mark would be. And so it ends up denigrating a sound biblical concept of, slavish identification with the powers of the state. I think that there's echoes of it there, but we have to be careful in how it gets communicated. And so I think sometimes silence is better on that. And that's just my opinion. I mean, I'm not saying people have to agree with that, but I that's just kind of where I see that. And I think that when we get into the mark of the beast, there's a total acquiescence, not only in behaviors and economics and all that kind of stuff, but actually at the point of worship itself. There's a cultic element to that mark.
And it's also, there's a sense in which like it has to do with conforming to the like people conforming to the image of the beast as opposed to the image of God. So which is so I think like it's easy to get caught up on some of the like less important elements and miss the real spiritual principle is at stake, which is don't allow yourself to conform to the image of the beast. Because I mean that's why we worship things, right? We worship things because we We want to somehow be like what we worship,
Mm-hmm.
and we're transforming our image into whatever it is that we worship.
Yeah. Well, and just like the historical
And
at one point in time, the Social Security card was viewed as the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we look back on it. I mean, I have
and
mine.
The barcode, and we've been through this. Yeah, I get it.
And it's like, so I think that we rob it of its spiritual significance when we drag it down to the solely political, and then we end up in a position where if somebody disagrees with us, then they must be, bearing that same mark in those kinds of things. And I think that's where I'm careful with those things. Although I do have no problem with the idea that at some point that actual physical mark will emerge within history. Right. I don't have a problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is,
well, I think the mark is much like the seal, and I don't know if it's like, I don't know that it is something that has a manifestation in the.
Yeah, I'm not saying
maybe, although it could though, because it's connected. It is connected to like being able to buy and sell. So maybe.
I'm thinking though, again, if it can't it be a beast? Again, I'm going back to this example of the skins of the tabernacle and the conversation in the Talmud, whether it's a animal or a beast, and like a beast.
Graham, I agree with that.
Graham, I see your comment. I think that's a fair take.
Yep.
What did Graham say?
Fair take. Oh, he said, and I totally agree with this. He said, "I'll let this one not be their mark, but conditioning people toward taking it." I think that's right.
That's a fair take.
And it is an image of the beast, which is, to me, it's like, well, okay, I'm a Christian anarchist, so it's not a big surprise that I'm going to say this, but the beast is the totalitarian state. Like, that is the beast. It's what it is. And
but I think, like, so let's go back to the vaccine thing for one quick second, because I think there are people who took the vaccines because the government had mandated it, and they just unthinkingly said, "I'm going to take it," right? And then I think there are people who kind of thought through, well, this is a new vaccine, this is risky, but I may have some pre-existing conditions where might confer some kind of benefit on me. So they felt like it was the right decision for them to make, right? And so I think you kind of have these mixed things happening. There's a bunch of things happening at the same time, right? And I took the vaccine. I don't care. Like, I mean, I had
to keep my job. I work for the state of Washington.
Yes.
So I didn't get any of the boosters. I didn't get any of the boosters though, because those weren't required, and I don't intend to. But even though my nephrologist thinks I should, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, I think I took the one booster and it made me sick, and I haven't taken anything else since, and I probably won't anymore. But I didn't have an issue with it, but it wasn't because I was like, I need to conform.
I also agree with that. And that is to me, that looks exactly like late consumer capitalism, which is a totalitarian state that freed you a lie about freedom.
So, but wouldn't that be the beast then, in a certain sense? Because
I think it is.
So it's really, again, because we're both.
I would say that the capitalism more, if you want to give, I would say no. I would say that capitalism tracks more with the whore of Babylon than the beast.
That's true.
I think the beast is the political power, kind of the power of, in our contemporary parlance, the power of the state. I think that the whore represents economic and cultural power and influence. And the state actually hates the culture and the economic influence because it has to work and navigate a relationship with a figure that cannot love. Like the difference between the virgin and the whore, right? Is the whore will give you all kinds of pleasures.
And I think that the political right is has more of a tendency when it goes wrong to go wrong in the direction of the beast, and the left in the direction of the whore.
Yeah, possibly. I think we kind of embody both. I think we can, at our worst, we can veer into,
which are definitely, in case you didn't know, if you weren't here for the beginning of the stream, those do map onto the Shadow King and the Red Lady. At the beginning of the stream, Sherry asked me to share my summary of what the Grail Country role-playing game that I'm developing is about.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah. So
This,
I
sorry,
do
go ahead.
want to get back to I do want to get back to something that Hezi said though, which is um, something you said. Can you repeat what you said about Moses and the Messiah? Can you I want to get
Yeah, I was saying that there is the Torah of Moses. However, ultimately, there is how Moses doesn't come into the land. There's the Torah, the oratory that we develop in the land, and then there's the exile, and there's this whole exoskeleton that I call it that we build, and that is the Torah that we have right now. However, ultimately, in the land, in the promised land, in the end of days, we are supposed to manifest again, in our former glory, so to speak. And the Torah that we're supposed to be playing with then, or embodying then, is the Messianic Torah, which is we're going back, to the default sort of sense, which doesn't necessarily have to look the same exact way as the Torah that we've had up until now. Now I know there's people that would definitely lose their hats over this, and I'm not saying that the words change or the requirements are different. However, the interpretation of these things could be very different, and we've seen the Torah develop and reform over many years. The point is that we always tether it back to Moses. There's something though when you're getting to the end line when you could start tethering it now to the finish line, which is the Messianic time, and what is that supposed to look like? So
this is interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is interesting, Hezi. I just want to make sure I got that right, because I can't. I'll have to find it for you later. But there's a part of M.L. Bach's Apocalypse of John where there is actually an image in the Book of Revelation about a heavenly scripture, and what Bach says is that essentially that the revelation, which is we call the Apocalypse of John, but the book calls itself the Revelation of Jesus Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the true author of Revelation, from the point of view of John, who wrote it, is that he's just presenting the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it is Jesus's revelation, and it's also seen as it is the first book of the heavenly scripture. Bach suggests symbolically.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in right behind that because I have a question I want to ask in a moment. Just Hezi, I've got a fun Hegelian question on how you're that kind of dialectical tension between the Torah of Messiah versus the Torah of Moses. But I'm gonna put some more coffee on here, so I'll let you guys go at it.
I have a question. Is the beast the number? Is it an idol? Will it be considered an idol?
Will what be a number? Will what be an idol? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
People are called that. Yeah, well, it does say that people will fall down and worship the image of the beast.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just in my life, it's manifested as this damn phone. So
yeah,
because I think about how, for me, I know I've said this before. It might be projecting, but it's my inability to actually. If I had to walk away from it, I don't think I could. I really don't.
Yeah.
That to me is the more subtle form of this.
I would say also, Nate, that this new this Messiah's Torah, right? Because it's a juxtaposition with us saying that the Torah will never change, and Moses' Torah has never changed, and you can never change anything from that. It has to happen from within. It would be a deeper, truer understanding of Moses' Torah. And it also could only be given by a man because because there was only one Sinai. That doesn't get repeated again. However, there is the naming of the animals. There is the joint work that we are doing together that could only happen. If I recall correctly, this comes up because there's the Leviathan, the ocean Leviathan fighting the ground Leviathan, the Re'em, and they clash together And during this epic fight, at the end, the righteous sit in either in a tent made out of the Leviathan skin, or they consume the Leviathan. Either way, one is asked, how do they do so? Because this isn't kosher for them to eat. The way the sacrifice happened, the way the animal was killed, happened during battle and wasn't according to Jewish law. And the answer is because this is Messiah's Torah, which is now like we understand it and manifest it at a truer, deeper level, which looks different than how we practice it now in exile, and which relates back to Jed's question about the connection to the land. You could only have that kind of play in the land. It's never going to be when it's still in this conceptual exoskeleton version of it.
Right, which would suggest that the New Jerusalem is the place where those two come together.
So then the question is the New Jerusalem just the old Jerusalem, just exposed in its final glory?
Well, I'm inclined to say that because I think that that the new heaven and new earth are new in a way that points toward them being transformed, right?
Like the new song.
Right, exactly. So it's new via transformation, not destruction. Like the old heaven and the old earth pass away, not because they're destroyed, but because they're transformed. And actually I think what changes is us. I don't think really from God's point of view, I don't think it's always the creation.
So I think that is the eighth note, which is our recognition of our connection to that music. Because there's only us interpreting music at a certain level right now, and how beautiful we lay on those patterns. However, if we realize how we're part of those patterns fully, there's sort of an eighth note to that. And that's true also about, you could say about, let's say, a New Jerusalem, so to speak, which is there's the Jerusalem we know today, but there's a fully embodied Jerusalem, which allows itself to phase shift. Right. So
this is why the Christian scriptures point both toward the arrival of the New Jerusalem, but Jesus also says the kingdom of God is within you. Both those,
which relates to the tabernacle, what God says, "V'asuli migdash," and they made me a temple, v'shachanti betocham, and I dwelled within them. It should have been I dwelled within it, singular. However, it dwelled within them because ultimately, again, this relates to the 613 and all the pieces. And why, if we talk about the Bible, each word and each letter is so specific. Hundreds of verses on all, the architecture and the bill of quantities, so to speak, of this tabernacle is because of to connect it to all the different the ideas of the complexities of neurons and cells and body parts and bones of the human body, which is supposed to be, that is where God is ultimately going to be dwelling. And at that point of history, the Israelites needed to understand that in a very structural, physical manifestation of that.
Right. And all we're saying as Christians is that this has happened in one instance already and is being made to be the shape of the entire cosmos in accordance with that.
Right. I guess the rub is just that, we don't see that. We don't see that manifesting in an individual. Right. But I mean, I also, in a certain extent, I don't know how much closer we could get about a topic like this.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I don't know, and I don't know that the distance matters much because, at least not from my point of view, because it's like your logo is still being moved to be made into the image of the logos, regardless. It's not. I just think that I don't think that what that has to do with, I don't really think is connected much to our notion of belief. And this is something I think that Jewish tradition kind of tends to get better than Christian tradition does, at least especially since I think maybe medieval Christian tradition was better, but post-Reformation, we have made it so much about belief that we have lost the more important, deeper sense of connection. So the very fact that Jewish worship is centered around the performance of mitzvah makes it less prone to fall into that trap of beliefism.
Well, I mean, again, so I could look at tying my shoes as a mundane thing, and I could look at tying my shoes as to make sure when I wake up in the morning that I'm tying my left shoe first, because the left resembles the left hand of God, which is din, which is justice, and the idea is the right is chesed, which is righteousness. And I wanted to start the day off by tying down the left hand to remind myself to always come from.
Exactly. Which means that you're connecting heaven and earth in every little thing that you do.
Correct.
And you're by participating in that pattern. And Christianity is guilty of having lost too much of that. Like, we need more of that. Like, we definitely do, because it's not healthy to make it all about like you assent to the correct creedal formula and you have the right belief. That doesn't really connect heaven and earth. It keeps it all in heaven, which is why also you see Christianity like developing this belief in it being about going to heaven, as opposed to the marriage of heaven and earth, which is what our scriptures actually point to. It's not, they don't point to just, I don't know where this even comes from, this idea that it's about escaping to heaven and being one of the lucky chosen few that gets to go to heaven, as opposed to the unfortunate ones who go to the bad place. It's like, that's not the story.
I agree. Jed, you left us to come back with your question.
Yeah, I've been toying around with like some Hegelian concepts, and like kind of building off of Jordan's work of the idea of the identity of identity and difference, right? Hegel takes that a step further, and we'll talk about how he still works ironically within a kind of a Platonic, Neoplatonic idea of procession, return, and remaining, right? That's still a structural element in his thinking. But in part of the return, the reditus, is the full and final, the full truth of any ontological reality is revealed in its contradiction, right? And so, like, so take like in the Christian story, like there are portions in the scriptures that say that God clearly says, "I am not a man,"
right?
Not a man like you, right? And so God is not human. And then the fullness of God's self-disclosure is when he becomes what he is not, which is human, right? And so I don't like
the negation of the negation.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that like contradiction. You got to be kind of careful with that, because it's not about like positing square circles or things like that, but that there is inversions in the manifestation of being, right? And so it with that kind of, and that's kind of in the process, the dialectical process of sublation, of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, which is not in Hegel's writings, but that's a good description of kind of one of his concepts. And so if we're looking at
can I just interrupt really quick, because you can, and this is actually, there's something profoundly Trinitarian and Christian about the logic of synthesis, in my opinion, because you're pointing toward a binding together of two things, essentially a duality. You're talking about a binding together of a duality that does not accomplish that by obliterating one side of the duality or creating merely something that is a mixture of both parts of the duality, but joins them together within a higher unity. That's what synthesis does.
I think that's implicit even in the term, like the special term for creation reserved for just God, bara. Like, if I understand it correctly, and I could be wrong, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but inherent in that term is the concept of binding, of bringing together.
What you mean by bringing together, like, I mean, like, Hegel's three different, like, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but like,
in a sense, yeah, there's like day one, right? The separation of light and darkness, but bringing them together in a habitable cosmos, right? So the binding of the two, so that the two can coexist in, that kind of bond of peace, which I one of the things that's so remarkable about Genesis 1 is theomachy is totally absent. This is a peaceful process of creation, of kind of of both separating and bringing together, right? So the dry land and the sea are separated, but they're brought together in the world as we experience it, right? And so I see that kind of, there's an element of that. I don't know if I'm describing.
And the mystics tell us both about divine light and divine darkness. So it's not like God is absent from either.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of my favorite
sorry,
verses
go ahead,
is like, I think it's in Psalm 81 or 82 where God answers from Sinai, and it's he calls it, I answered you from the secret place of thunder, right? And there's like darkness and light happening at Sinai, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but I'm curious, Hezi, what you have to say about some of that stuff. So. And how that pertains specifically to the Torah of Moses and the Torah of Messiah.
So I would say that, I mean, you mentioned Tiamat, right? So the Torah is obviously, when they use the terms like tohu vavohu, right, they're alluding to some of these concepts, obviously, and giving them like a reinterpretation or like a regrounding. But in that chaos, right, God calls up, so to speak, from the chaos, right? Vihi or, and there like it is sort of the logos, and the word brings, sort of rips it out of the chaos and identifies it, right? So I'm saying you have in this chaos, which is one portion of this equation. Then you have God calling it out, right? Vihi or, and then there's the netov, and then God identifies it as good. The good is when the you would say that synthesis actually happens, which is then recognized as good, which is really the agentic. Elohim himself is the good. Him recognizing and allowing something to exist is the good that we call being, or that we like sort of recognize and see. And by the way, when God makes man, right, that is still the Veyehi. That's still that's still in the middle stage. Then he says, God notices, Velo tov liot adam belado. It is not good that the man is by himself. Right, so I'm saying it's not at the level of light yet. I'm saying it's not good. It requires another partner. I require to build something else out of here, and only then does man become good, or the concept of man become good, because I found its partner, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I think the way that relates to the Torah, there is Sinai, and then there is the Torah that's given to us. However, that Torah in the tabernacle, that is, again, it's shattered and then redone again. And then we have to sort of take that into the land. And then again, that is fumbled. There's a requirement, again, in a certain respect, when Messiah comes and we get the Messiah's Torah, which is like we fully go as deep as we can into this Torah, could it then potentially reach its level of, and now it's good. Now it's fulfilled in a certain.
Would you say like the Messianic Torah is maybe like conceptually like similar to like the idea of like an inner law, like we would see in like some of the new covenant promises in the prophet Jeremiah, like the law that is within, that's written, inscribed upon the heart? Is that kind of conceptually, is that tracking?
Yes. I mean, now you could say a lot of that is, again, the Talmud talks about how, when Moses was up in the mountain on Sinai, he also learned all these secrets, and then in his tent he would first meet with Aaron, and then he would meet with Aaron's children, and then he would meet with the Joshua, the congregation. So there were different levels of interpretation and details that sort of Moses got into with the people. So I think it's us returning back to that deeper understanding of what's sort of what lies behind these words and these explanations. And going back to Jordan, right, when Jordan gives like his example of like of a hyper truth, or that this is a story that sort of that repeats itself again, and then you could look at the story from different perspectives. I just think we'll have, it's like we have the web, the new telescope, the new camera that they sent out there. Now we just see like these higher levels of resolution, and you've had the picture like 20 years ago from the Hubble or 10 years ago, but now you're like, oh, that just tweak in resolution is like so much more impressive. So I think that's what we're looking at. We're looking
I really at some point want to talk to you guys about like what we're doing lately with this conversation about the virtual and the real, where I think we're falling back into a subtle Cartesian trap that we set for ourselves, where we're showing that we're really still Cartesians and materialists when we do that, and that we have to find a better way of talking about these things. Like, I understand there are things about the new technology that's emerging that we are concerned about, but I think we have to find a better way to talk about this than just saying the virtual bad, real good. That's a mistake, I think.
They're all just.
But I don't have time because my wife let me know earlier that she needs some tech support for her friend, so I have to go. But Jed, I made you an admin. So if you go into your email and accept that really quick,
okay,
then I should be able to leave, and you and Hezi can keep talking.
Oh, that'd be awesome. If you got the time, Hezi, I would love to do that.
I can do a few more minutes. I'm supposed to be working, but like I tell myself that this is also working. So yeah, I could talk for like 10 more minutes if you're down.
Okay.
Let me know once you've done that, and then I'll leave studio and go do tech support.
Have a great day, Nate.
You too, Hezi.
And brush Jacob off your shoulder. Don't take it too literally.
Oh, Jake, I have no ill will toward Jacob.
All right. Do I need to enter the studio? Because I'm in now as an admin.
Oh, does it show you as an admin?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Then you don't need it. You're good. I'm just gonna leave.
Okay. All right. I got to enter as the.
Sorry.
Hello, all. While we wait for Jed, let me see some comments over here. I see Nechama's over here. Hello, Nechama. Grim, what's going on, brother? I hope you're doing well. You stirred the pot a little, not intentionally, of course.
He's a good pot stirrer. That's actually a good role to play. We need that.
We need a pot stirrer. I mean, hopefully, as long as the intention is to make sure you have a good pot stew to share with everyone at the end of the day.
You don't want any burnt bits at the bottom. You got to keep it circulating, you know?
Right.
So Hezi, there's something you said that just like it went off like explosions in my mind. When you're talking about the breaking of the Torah, when Moses breaks the 10 Commandments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that breaking open process. I wonder if there's a sense of if there's somewhat of a necessity in the process for the people. Like obviously God doesn't need that to, God doesn't know neither of that. But I'm wondering, like, kind of, within your, I haven't put much thought into it. That's why it kind of is like this. Could you describe maybe some of the meaning and significance of that from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, there's a book called in Hebrew it's called The Commandments and the Commandments debris, basically, but it has to talk about reconstruction and deconstruction, and it's a take of this fascinating rabbi on postmodernism. But ultimately, there is a when Moses destroys the 10 Commandments, it says like the letters, the fiery letters that God wrote it with, they disappeared. They flew up, up into the air, and like the second version we got was never like the real version. Now, having said that, in the ark, we had the original and the new ones, right? They're always together.
Yeah.
And there was that holds a lot of significance because we recognize that like what the shattering was and where we are right now. And that shattering also reminded us of the shattering reminded us of that disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
How, and the relationship changes from that point, because God says, like, if you can't, like, if you want the full glory, it comes with the full sense of responsibility. Like, you're fully exposed then with responsibility, which is post golden calf. I got to wipe these guys out, Moses. Like, like, you know, and obviously Moses sort of, you know, makes God keep true to his word, right? Like, you know, it's too late. Like, these words have been said already. You made promises to Abraham. All this is part of the story you're telling. Like, this is happening. However, that shattering is a reminder that that we weren't ready, and in a certain sense, that shattering still echoes with us, like a cross, where like we're constantly trying to rebuild and recapture those fleeting letters that sort of disappeared, and a lot of that happens. A lot of that happens already when Moses dies, like Joshua forgets like I think it's like 400 different laws that he knew, and there's something about the fact that that the first commandments were given to Moses. There was a shattering there, like that never made it back down to us, and we received something that is divine, but not fully tethered to the source in a certain extent. And that leads to like a lot of confusion and a lot of doubt. However, over the 2,000 years, we are slowly trying to replace sort of those elements back together. But this sort of brings in postmodernism, which is that in a certain sense is another shattering of the commandments, because those great narratives that we all had sort of break down, and it requires us to sort of piece together again this version of this coherence that we need. So there's this rabbi, specifically Rabbi Shagara, sees that there's something called like light postmodernism, where these concepts allow us to sort of return to a pre-language mode, where we could look at it as something terrifying, as in like, you know, we don't have the tools anymore to engage. However, we could on the flip side, we could see that this shattering allows us to potentially reinterpret and redefine certain concepts, which allows us to then move forward to newer heights. So
interesting. When you're talking, like what like is going off in my mind, and this I don't know how this connects, but like this is maybe a little bit more of a poetic riff, but it brings to mind the Leonard Cohen song Anthem, where he says, "Ring them bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." Right. And I the first time I heard those lyrics, you know, several years ago, I was just thinking, wow, it's amazing that, you know, here's a Jewish guy saying, forget your perfect offering, you know, and that's really, in a sense, there's something profoundly postmodern about that song itself, kind of what you're talking about here. I think it does connect. I think regardless of what spiritual communities we belong to, we are exhausted by history. We're on the far end of history right now. And so many things have crumbled and cracked, and the world has become has become strange to us again, in a way. And I wonder, it's like something within that breaking open process, like, you know, Jesus talked about that unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it cannot but bear fruit. Well, what happens when a seed germinates, right? It cracks in half, and then it grows, right, and brings this abundance. And I wonder if there's an element of that struggle that we find, that where we find ourselves shattered, in a sense, or we find ourselves in shattered communities or broken communities that aren't quite pieced together the way that they should be, right? Is also still for us here now, that opportunity for God's light to shine into the crevices and to permeate that external surface so that it can get into the inside of us. And I there's something profound about that idea, that image of the breaking of the tablets of stone, that I almost wonder, like I said, we weren't ready for it. We weren't ready for the completion. And so, God I think there's almost a humor to that of like, okay, you're not quite ready for this. I'm going to give you some training wheels so that you can kind of see what I'm trying to reveal, which I think Moses did receive the fullness of God's self-disclosure, but the people weren't ready for that yet. And
well, they tell him we're not ready. They say,
yeah.
They say like, we can't handle more than this. God has to well, Moses goes up, and then God says like, now that you came up, go back down. And you can be like, I just got up. What are you sending me back down? And he's like, go tell people that they can't touch the mountain. He's like, I told them that they can't touch the mountain. He's like, no, I'm changing the order right now. Now I want you to come back and tell Joshua and the wise men that they could come up to a certain level. Basically, God sort of switches the whole scenario because he realizes, okay, like they're not ready for this level. So we're going to do this differently. We're not going to have like this whole show that they're getting like this unfiltered experience. However, we're going to create it at certain levels because I see that it's too much for them to handle. And you see this also in the tabernacle, which is God, like post the golden calf, right? Which you could be like, this was like an affront to God. Why on earth are we playing with cherubs then? Like, why are you bringing in like this idol worship into, you just said like, you can't have gold and you're not going to do things. Like now you're bringing two clearly Mesopotamian gods into the tabernacle, which is just like bonkers if you think about it. Mm-hmm. And I think God very much then sort of recognizes, okay, these Israelites are definitely not like, they're not there yet. So I'm going to take a tool like they're aware of already, which is called like, the cherub is the chariot of the gods in that time. Yeah. And God says, okay, we're going to take that symbol that they clearly recognize, and they're going to realize that when they get inside to the Holy of Holies, there's nothing above it. There is no one riding it. There is no picture of a god riding it, which is like what you guys see from Mesopotamia or around you. There is just this abstract idea called God, which, so again, these are training wheels for the population. Same thing with the sacrifices. They are not ready yet to fully transition into this kind of conversation with me, God, where they see me face to face and they have this kind of conversation, which why also God tells Moses, like, forget these guys. Let's start again with like, with people at a higher level. However, the response of the Levites after the golden calf is they don't recognize their mother and they don't recognize their father and they kill everyone. And this goes back to what I said about Isaac not recognizing Jacob and Esau. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're going to be fully committed to that unadulterated conversation with God, then your morals and the way you look at the world is going to start to skew, which is, you could then see the population's not ready for that yet. They're not ready to deal with that. And hence we have a whole long history where slowly but surely there's a progression, like you saying, like the prophet eventually saying, like, it's a still small voice, it's not on fire, it's not on brimstone. Like, I'm slowly making the conversation more abstract. The Talmud says that once you denounce pagan worship, you're considered a Jew, which is like a crazy statement to say, but the attitude is like, once you realize you're not bowing down to the statue anymore, even if you're like now an atheist, like, you've already come halfway. Mm-hmm. Like, you're already like, you're down the rabbit hole of realizing it's more than like, the statue that you need to move away from. So again, it could be that the Ten Commandments at that time, just like when Adam and Eve sinned, when it was just too soon. If you just waited a little longer, that could have been done properly. But here too, it was just too soon. And in certain ways, we're always missing the mark. But unlike the Greek tragedy, the prophet in the Jewish scripture is always saying, you could change us. Yeah. Act differently, and the result will be different. It's not like, this is not, and again, like in a Greek concept, tragedy means like you can't change it. It is doomed for a tragic ending. That is not the case in the Jewish story.
Yeah. Well, and it brings to mind kind of like you see that process on display in the 51st Psalm, right? The concluding verses where he's talking about, you don't delight in sacrifice, but then the end, whether you believe it was editorially added or a part of the original, and to me that's kind of irrelevant. It's the text that we have is, then you will accept the sacrifice. Once the cleansing work has been done, then the sacrifice is acceptable, and that kind of echoes itself even in the Christian tradition, because there are Christian traditions that, like the Presbyterian tradition that I belong to, was a very no images of Christ, and the old Presbyterian churches didn't even have images of the cross, right? No images whatsoever. But then we look at our Seventh Ecumenical Council within the history of Christianity that not only condones but demands the use of iconography in worship, right? Because you kind of have a place for both. And there's kind of, we don't know how to deal with the oppositional realities. And I think the work of creation, of binding them together and giving them both a place, right, God doesn't seem in certain areas in the scriptures to be particularly impressed with the cult. But then we have these divine injunctions to make sure that the cult is done properly, right? The worship is in a particular order and in a specific way. And maybe there is a place for both, but we have a hard time, I think, being able to navigate those oppositional realities. And so the history itself becomes the tableau where that plays itself out, where we're having to learn how to get there from, and nobody can ever occupy both sides of the dialectic. Sometimes you got to choose which route you're going to go. Like, am I going to be Presbyterian or am I going to be Orthodox, right? It's kind of one or the other. You don't get to be Presbydox, right? And so I'm kind of wondering if some of the things you're talking about, they just, as you kind of loop it into that postmodern context, I think are profoundly resonant for, even myself within my own Christian location. Is like, we have to grapple with some of these things, like the contradictions of within our own tradition. Like, how do we deal?
Well, first of all, I definitely think that in Christianity, there needs to be more digging down to realize, like, where are we disagreeing? Where are we not disagreeing? My experience from like this little corner is that there's a lot of confusion within Christianity, within like these different sects. Like, what do they mean about these terms? And then like, you realize that if you dig like a few layers deep, like you guys each have your own, let's say, patron saints or pastors or fathers that have like, this cross-pollination. So like, I think it would do a lot of good just sort of in general to dig deep internally. However, like these contradictions in mysticism, which again, in Judaism, again, mysticism is connected to Kabbalah, but Kabbalah is called like receiving, because like it's just like you're supposed to get to another level where you could then receive this truer wisdom that's already there. Not that you're necessarily like digging and like searching for, but rather you're supposed to be opening up and receiving. But either way, these contradictions are there all the time. Whether it's good or like they exist, and they could find their resting place in, or their balance in the Ein Sof, right? The infinite. However, up until postmodernism, having those concepts are very hard to think of, but postmodernism sort of allows us to shatter that and now start potentially thinking in those terms. Where like, okay, maybe now a concept like that, where like these narratives all don't really exist, is me starting to peek a little behind the veil of modernism and be like, okay, so like I still don't fully grasp it, but I can understand that there is a place for these opposites to sort of, and again, like the quantum world allows for that, right? The superposition starts sounding very wooey, but that starts sort of starting like a language or a jargon. Well, I would even say even if quantum doesn't necessarily relate to that, the use of that jargon is showing you like the human brain trying to understand this kind of complexity, where you could have.
And I think we have crossed that Heisenberg moment in religion as well, right? The problem of observation of,
Right.
A and non-A both being A,
Right.
and it's a really a fascinating notion that does open us up to be able to say that, like, these things are bound in our, what a thing is bound up in our observation of it in the first place. Like, you can't remove the observer from the equation in a sense. And, that
But-
to me, what it opens up, what I find it to be fascinating, I think this is where science can actually teach religion in a sense, learn from sciences, is the willingness to take an experimental approach, right? Of working off of certain axioms, like God exists, God is good, all these kinds of things. These are axiomatic. We take this as true. But, like I posted that lecture into the Vox maybe a few weeks ago that was talking about the confluence between in medieval Christian mysticism, medieval Jewish mysticism, is there's a lot of cross-pollination. Like, Ein Sof is very much connected to certain concepts that Meister Eckhart is talking about in the divine methods, right? As they're beginning to discover these things together, and maybe in some way there's maybe historical conversations happening in cross-pollination that we're not aware of. But it does look like, based on just textual evidence, these are developing somewhat independently. Is this way of seeing God that upholds this sense of, like, this profound mystery that, I am definitely, in my own Christian mystical practice, like the notion of, the divine no thingness, the Ein Sof, is important, because you realize that there are certain truths you can only arrive at in negation, right? In the darkness, in a sense. And there's Anthony Doerr writes a brilliant novel called All the Light We Cannot See. And the title of the book comes out of a line in the book that's talking about, like, the black darkness of space. Scientific, the scientist was giving a radio lecture and just says that the darkness is just all of the light that we cannot see. It's still light. It's just imperceptible as light.
So this resonates with me with the concept of Tzimtzum and the retracting of God, right? Which, like, he allows in. There's a retracting which allows for a space where God is not there, sort of, and even in that not there-ness, that not there-ness stems from God, but that not there-ness is for allow there to be a space where something else could exist. And then there's God shines in the divine light, but even the divine light itself is too powerful, so there's the shattering of the vessels. And our job is to identify across the world where the divine light is, and raise up these sparks, and sort of that we could rebuild this vessel. So this is true, and ironically, I mean, this came up where, I don't know if you heard the conversation with Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan that was making the rounds.
I haven't seen it yet. I've got it bookmarked, but
so towards the end, Eric talks about his hanging out with Kanye and his talking to Kanye about this, and Kanye talking about Hitler being a good dude, right, is coming from a place of raising those sparks, right? Like, my job is to see, like, the best and good in everyone. I'm even going to try to do that with Hitler. Now, granted, that did not work out well for him on a PR level, but as a Jew, there is something beautiful even in that attempt when I see where it's coming from. So I'm not getting into, like, what he actually ended up saying, but there's something about that which is, like, our job is to try to identify those things and see those things. And that's why, like, even in evil, right, that it's evil, God retracting himself allows for us to have free will, which also allows, or let's say the perception of free will, but that allows for evil to exist as well. Now, that evil, again, stems from the good, and in that evil, there's a saying which is you have to find the good in every person, even someone that's pure evil. Because maybe there's a drop that's not evil, and if you could identify it, then he could identify it in himself, and then he could actually reach that level that you identified, and then sort of start making his way sort of back up. But it's our job to like sort of locate those things. And I think in a conversation of postmodernism, that potentially starts becoming a little easier to start doing once you could remove the veil of these like hard these sort of terms, which again could even be a response to the Tower of Babel, right? As Zephaniah says, eventually we all have to call a God in one accord. And with Babel, we were the words were specific things, right? Like a brick is a brick, and like the issue was we decided that we know the definitions, we know the definition of God. He's in the sky, and we could attack him. It requires us to have unity with multiplicity, and you could have that in postmodernism when terms could potentially mean more than one thing. I also know how dangerous that is as well.
Well, and to tie that back in an interesting way, like into the idea of brokenness and shattering, and we look at kind of the fires in which Hitler and the whole of Germany and the whole of Europe were forged within in World War I, is like, in a sense, you have, the experience of let's just say, just for the Germans themselves, the experience of World War I and the brutality of battles like Verdun and the Somme, and just probably historically, even World War II, in terms of the actual battles themselves, were not more savage or brutal than those battles in World War I. And they're developed in that context, right? And they're forged in that context. And what's interesting in Germany, if you look at what happened within that shattering of Germany in World War I, is it kind of, it produced two different kinds of people, two different kinds of responses to that brokenness and that shattering. Is there was a lot of people early on and well on into, the reign of the Third Reich that were opposing Hitler, and they were developed in the same forge and in the same fires of history. And Hitler went one direction, and I think of like the Christians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth. These guys were involved in World War I as well. But they come up with the Barmen Declaration and openly opposing National Socialism, right? And there's a lot of different groups that are also opposing. They just, they could not withstand ultimately the overwhelming power that had accumulated within the Nazi regime. But Hitler, you wonder, like, if he hadn't experienced the Battle of the Somme or Verdun or the line, would he have become what he became? Would he have responded to that shattering moment in the same way? And I can see where, Kanye maybe an ill-advised attempt to try to, the way he worded those things, I think maybe undercut his own intuitions and what he was meaning to say. Because like, obviously, like there's really still no ultimate justification for the evils of the Nazis and of Hitler, right?
I guess the attempt of saying like, I could see the good even in him was like sort of being like, let's bring us all together. Like, there's clearly a lot more in common. If I could see the good in Hitler, then like, of course, between like the Republican and the Democrat, like we got to find common ground. So again, it's Sherry and I were talking about this, and I mentioned this before, that in Judaism, when a sage or a wise man walks into a room, you need to stand up. Or let's say if your father walks into a room, you got to stand up. When a sage or a rabbi comes to the mourner's home, right, everyone needs to stand up because that's the law. However, the mourner doesn't need to stand up. And the reason is because at that time, the mourner is the only one that is going through this particular lesson with dealing with pain, anguish, evil. And he is considered the wise one, because no one else could sort of feel what he's going through. And the attitude is not to tell him it's going to be okay. God works in mysterious ways. Like, really, this is for your benefit. Like, while that's all true, he can't hear that. So even, Kanye attempting to, to have this sort of speech is falling on deaf ears. And this is very sad, because I think at this point of political discourse in the States, and in a certain extent, this is also true in Israel right now, I don't know if people are hearing each other anymore. And it's more than just like, well, if they explain the facts, like if the facts and even the word nuance and being like, 1 second, let me steal, man. If all these are already a problem, then like the dialogue has really sort of like completely collapsed. And it's a very scary place to be right now.
It is, and I think that like the attempt to try to recover a sense of common humanity, you know, even in the failed attempt, is there's instruction for us in that, right? Is like we've got to get to that place where we can see that filial bond between one person and the next, simply because we're all God's children, right? And we're bound together in this same unfolding story. I know that I want to respect your time, and I've got a couple things I got to get to, but you know, I really love these ideas that you're talking about, especially when we get into the Ein Sof, right? Is I think that there's something that's occurred to me, is that the withdrawal of God, or the absence of God, or the darkness of God is in itself a manifestation, is in itself
1000%.
right. And I was listening to one of Zizek's lectures on Christian atheism, right? And he, you know, yes, the cross God becomes an atheist, right? And I think that's kind of he picks up on Chesterton there, and I think I like his intuition, but I don't think he delves far enough into that cry of dereliction, of, you know, which is actually from the Psalms, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Is that in that absence, like, you know, in the Christian conception of things, in the incarnation, God is present even in his absence, because that's God who's making the cry as God to God, or as human to God. But at the minimal level, you know, the human is always present in God's absence, and has to grapple with the meaning of where are you, and why has this been allowed to happen, and the silence of heaven is its own speech, and I find that to be, at least spiritually, like there's a nourishment that comes in that, is that even when I feel like God is absent or missing, or his presence cannot be felt, that even that in itself is maybe even a deeper and more powerful manifestation than those times when we do feel like God is near, and we do feel like he is close, and we rejoice in that sense of intimacy. But that's not always the experience, I don't think, for anybody, you know. That to me, I think that cuts across any religious or denominational line, that feeling of absence, and the way that we grapple, you know, under heaven, under the sun, you know, like Kohelet says, like there's nothing new under the sun, everything, you know, the cynicism I find in that in Ecclesiastes is a refreshing, you know.
When so there's an interpretation, right, in Job, when God is speaking to the angels, right, and then like the Satan comes, right, and God says, "Me'ain bata," right? Where did you come from? And the interpretation is Me'ain baita. You came from the Ein Sof. You come from the nothingness. Mm-hmm. And this is relating to Job, which is, we were just told he has everything, right? And God says, like, where will he meet God? Where will you'll meet him in the nothingness. You'll find him where you're deprived from me. And Satan tells God, you have created a chisita alav. You created like a fence around him his whole life. Like he has everything. The only way he's going to see you is in the nothingness. That's the only place he could see you. So God, like, that's where God is sort of is presenting the devil over here as like, okay, so for him to see that part of me, we're going to have to drill through all these fences where he could now he could experience the aim. He could participate in the nothingness. So it's a play of word over there. Mm-hmm. Rav Shagar's book, which I think you would appreciate, is called Faith Shattered and Restored. And it's a very, very, very good book. There's an English version of it as well. Definitely recommended. Faith
Shattered and Restored. We'll have to chat some more on this stuff in the future. I'm looking at the clock here. The conversation has gone on for almost 3 hours. So Hezzy, it's nice to meet you for the first time, and we'll go ahead and maybe put a button in this conversation. But
You
man,
got it.
this has been nourishing, so I appreciate it, my friend.
You got it. You two have a great day, and yeah, have a great day. We'll talk.
Sounds good. Now I got to figure out how to end the meeting.
End the meeting, exactly.
Let's see.
You should have like end broadcast on the top right.
There we go. All right. Take it easy. Have a good one. Take care.